I thought I'd start, before I begin the sort of main meaty section of my paper, just explaining a little bit about how I've come to sort of find my toes dipped in the waters of animal studies. My primary area of research, like Ryan has explained, focuses on the material culture of late medieval disability. So for the past 3-ish years, I've been looking at the kind of production, function and use of disability aids in the late medieval West. So things like crutches, wheelchairs, carts, sedan chairs, prosthetic limbs, spectacles, all these kind of objects that people were using in the Middle Ages to overcome bodily impairments. However, the more research that I did into assistive technology, the more it became sort of glaringly obvious that I was missing out this kind of sense of community, individual and animal assistance that was available to people with impairments. So when I say people or animals acting as aids, I'm talking about images such as these. So my thesis is largely dependent upon images, because I'm trying mostly to access the kind of lives and experiences of people who couldn't necessarily write, or people who didn't necessarily leave any solid archaeological evidence. So images are invaluable to me, so I'm going to be showing you a lot of those today. So to start off with then, thinking about humans as mobility aids, I have these two examples up here on the PowerPoint. So this one on the right is a miniature of Edward the Confessor carrying a disabled beggar called Gilly Michael. So you can see how Edward here is fulfilling the role of a mobility aid by facilitating Gilly's movement to this shrine. Without Edward, Gilly would be unable to get to the shrine himself. Because of his status, it's unlikely that he was able to afford particularly sort of expensive mobility aids. On the left-hand side, conversely, we have an image of two squires carrying a knight off the battlefield. Again, they're acting in the same way, they're acting as mobility aids, again facilitating this movement of the knight who is unable to walk due to injury off that battlefield there. So I started getting into this animal studies kind of discipline by first thinking about humans as mobility aids and how individuals and communities work together to help people with impairments. And this led me to think about animals as mobility aids. And this started with thinking about things like horses and oxen and that kind of thing. And this is exemplified really nicely in Lucas Cranach's image here of the Fountain of Youth. So I've blown up this, this section here, which is from the left-hand side of the painting. And you can see there you've got a few different things going on. You've got an elderly lady being taken to the Fountain of Youth on a horse. You have some elderly people in a carriage here, and then a similar carriage at the back there. And these horses are acting here as what I'm calling a kind of horse carriage kind of cyborg. They've got this kind of relationship with the material object itself and are sort of augmented in that way, becoming a disability aid. We were just talking about this before and thinking about how to approach this idea of an animal-human kind of relationship in the sense of disability. Again, I just want to point out that I'm being a terrible art historian at the moment. All of these images that I'm showing you in quite a two-dimensional way because I just don't have time to break down every single image. But I just want you to bear in mind that these medieval images that I am showing aren't kind of ideologically free of kind of political or social overtones, and they're not just windows onto the past, which is kind of a little bit how I'm using them, just to kind of introduce this topic, but just worth bearing in mind that they are multi-layered and come with kind of, especially in the Fountain of Youth, gendered and social problems as well. So having looked at sort of these horses and these carts, I've started to think about whether or not medieval people were using guide dogs and that kind of thing as assistance animals. I think if you ask a modern person what first comes to mind when you mention an assistance animal, they will probably jump to a guide dog. I certainly would, because the kind of language of guide dogs is everywhere. It's on shop windows and restaurants and that kind of thing. So it's familiar to us as a 21st century audience. I was thinking, was this happening in the Middle Ages? Were people making use of dogs as assistance animals? So scientific research as I'm sure we'll be hearing about later, has shown that modern assistance dogs offer impaired individuals a sense of safety, that they increase the owner's feelings of competence, they offer companionship, and they act as a focus of care and concern. And consequently, they have this ability to act as social facilitators, providing an opening for social interaction and encounters within public settings. And so consequently, although it can be argued that guide dogs didn't really exist until the 20th century, with the establishment of the first guide dog training school in Oldenburg in Germany in 1916, or with the work of Dorothy Harrison Eustace in the late 1920s, I still decided to go down this path of investigating whether assistance dogs were being used in the Middle Ages. So, as it turns out, late medieval dogs were and still are interpreted in several ways. And this is dogs, broadly speaking, this isn't just assistance animals. So in her article, Dogs, God's Worst Enemies, Sophie Menack argues that due to a combination of factors, dogs were viewed with a kind of suspicion and negativity in the Middle Ages. And these factors that kind of triggered this negativity are sort of multifold, and they include things like the negative portrayal of dogs in the Bible, which I'll discuss a little bit later, the fear of rabies, which was thought to be a kind of venomous disease that was transmitted from dogs to humans and was feared at the time, and the kind of concerns about kynocephali. Kynocephali are late medieval dog-headed men. They lived in the kind of East, and they were prone to a kind of warlike temperament and cannibalism. So there was a kind of concern over them as well. And whilst that mistrust might be seen in theory, it doesn't seem to have impacted on people's relationships with dogs in kind of reality. People of all ages and statuses were owning dogs. They frequently appear in manuscript marginalia, in artwork. They're popular in heraldic devices, and they were carefully named according to published lists. There's a really nice one of these in a 15th century manuscript of the Master of the Game, which was written by Edward, Duke of York, who was Master of the Game under Henry IV of England. And dogs were really well cared for as well. So influential sort of scientific and medical writers such as Albertus Magnus were talking about how to keep your dogs healthy and care for them and provide good diets, and suggesting medicinal treatments for common ailments that the dogs were prone to in the Middle Ages, such as impetigo or scabies. So people were writing broadly on dogs, people were caring for them and naming them. And I think this image here, taken from Gaston Phoebus's Book of the Hunt, demonstrates that really nicely. You can see that I've just pulled out two details of this. You can see that the dog in the top is being bandaged, and the one in the bottom is having its paws washed. And this is just an indication of the kind of aftercare that went into noble dogs after they've been on a hunt. So again, demonstrating that people are willing to spend time and money taking care of these animals. And even though hunting dogs aren't assistance animals for people with disabilities, I'd still very much include them in the kind of rhetoric of assistance dogs, as they're fundamental both practically in hunting for game food, but also ideologically in the construction of noble identity, although I'll talk again about that a little bit later on. And so then this desire to care for and to name medieval dogs suggests that they were an important and ubiquitous part of everyday life. And consequently, I've decided to split the second half of my paper into 3 sections relating to my title. So thinking about the different roles of assistance dogs in the late Middle Ages as companions, as servants, and as visual signifiers. So in terms of companionship then, medieval dogs as companions were sort of most useful in their ability to provide humans with emotional and material support. As I mentioned earlier, modern assistant dogs are so successful not simply because they can help to fulfil daily tasks, but also because they offer companionship and a sense of safety. The ability to encourage social interaction for impaired individuals can be seen in the story of Saint Roch, and I've got a nice image of Saint Roch here on the PowerPoint. So while travelling across Italy in the 1300s, curing people and their cities of pestilence, Saint Roch succumbed to the plague himself at Piacenza. He was cast out of the town by the residents who feared the transmission of the disease, and he consequently took up residence outside the city, in the woods, in a kind of sort of makeshift shelter of twigs and leaves. Whilst living in the woods, a dog who belonged to a nobleman named Gotthard brought from his lord's table bread to Rock. And the dog continued to bring bread to Rock every day until one day his master, this nobleman from the nearby town, eventually followed his dog out of a kind of curiosity about what it was getting up to each day. And he came to the lodge of St. Roch and there beheld how familiarly the hound delivered the bread to St. Roch. So in line with those scientific studies that I discussed above, St. Roch's dog is acting as both a kind of caregiver and a facilitator of social interaction. He not only brings Roch bread, providing important physical sustenance, but the curiosity about his dog's whereabouts also ultimately brings the nobleman to Roch and enables this social interaction between those two humans. The story goes on, and Roch manages to continue his good deeds through his relationship with Gotthard. So ultimately, it's a really fulfilling dynamic between the two. I particularly like this image, this late medieval image of St. Roch, because it foregrounds the importance of the dog in the story. You'll notice that the nobleman is teeny and tiny and far away, right there at the back. But the dog is right here at the front, and it's foregrounded as more important than his master there. You can see that he's sat patiently with the loaf of bread in his mouth, whilst this angel treats the plague buboes on St. Roch's leg. And so consequently, this kind of obedient, helpful dog is the perfect companion for Roch. He provides assistance by supplying physical nourishment, but also by this purpose of providing social interaction as well. So the second group of medieval assistance dogs that I want to talk about, I'm going to categorise as servants. So in the Middle Ages, much like today, dogs were praised by their loyalty and their ability to both serve their masters and fulfil tasks on their masters' behalfs. So as Serpell points out, the domestic dog exists precariously in the no man's land between the human and non-human worlds, oscillating uncomfortably between the roles of high-status animal and low-status person. In this position as neither fully beast nor person, dogs demonstrate a unique combination of intelligence and subservience, which allowed medieval people to shape them into kind of servants. A wonderful example of this can be seen in the legend of St. Gwynfryd, which I've had to stick on this slide because I couldn't fit it onto my servant slide, just down here. So St. Gwynfryd was a medieval dog, and the legend goes that St. Gwynfryd's master left the house and left the dog with the baby in the cradle. The dog spotted a serpent approaching the cradle and attacked the serpent. In the fight, the cradle was knocked over and the baby fell out of it, but the baby was fine. The dog killed the venomous serpent that was going to attack the baby. When the master gets home, he notices his dog, Gwynfryd, covered in blood. He sees the cradle knocked over and he jumps to conclusions. He takes his sword and he stabs the dog and kills Gwynfryd. It's only on further inspection, as he's looking around the room, that he notices the child, who's laid on the floor, sleeping peacefully, apparently, next to the dead snake, the dead serpent. And it's then that he realises what actually went on, and he's filled with remorse and regret. So he takes the dog, he buries the dog, and plants trees around where the dog's buried. The local people in the area hear about this kind of tale, and they revere Gwynfryd as a saint. And then various miracles are performed on the site of St. Gwynfryd's grave. So this dog is acting as a kind of perfect canine serpent. It's protecting the family whilst the master is away, fulfilling its duty as a member of the household, even though in this case it is to its detriment. And so this willingness to serve and protect individuals who can't necessarily protect themselves, such as the baby in the cradle, is characteristic of assistance dogs. And even today we see assistance dogs being trained to protect children, and particularly sleeping children, from abusive adults. So this isn't necessarily a new thing. And this woodcut depicts the whole story, so it's a little bit small, but you can see Gwynfryd is down here, having had his head cut off, and the baby and the snake are just over this side. The woman and the bird are just additions for the woodcut. They don't feature in the original story. So consequently then, having seen how medieval dogs could act as both carers and protectors of the vulnerable, it's unsurprising that medieval dogs were also employed by blind people to act as mobility aids, similarly to modern guide dogs. Although I've not yet found a written reference to guide dogs, they certainly seem to appear in medieval manuscript marginalia. So these are the pictures that are drawn around the edges of medieval manuscripts. So take, for example, this image that I have on the PowerPoint there. Here we can see three musicians busking for money, the central of which has a dog on a lead. Here the dog's role as a servant for the musician appears to be twofold. Firstly, he's carrying an alms bowl in his mouth. So this is a common visual trope within medieval artwork, that beggars have these small bowls which they'll hold out for people to donate money into. So the musician is unable to hold that out himself, so the dog is acting as an extension of the musician there by holding out that bowl and fulfilling that task on the musician's behalf. But secondly, the dog has an implied function as a guide dog. So it's kind of difficult to make out because this image has faded, but I've enlarged the image of the man's face in the top right. I don't know if you can just about see, but he has eyes that are closed and sort of downward facing. Again, really difficult to make out because it's kind of faded over time. But if you squint, you might just kind of make it out. And these kind of closed, downcast eyes are again another common visual trope within medieval artwork to represent blindness. And this leads me to believe that the man not only keeps the dog to assist him in raising money as a part of his kind of career as a musician, but also uses the dog similarly to a modern guide dog. You can see again, although again it's quite faded, that the dog's lead extends from the dog's collar up right to the man's hand. And again, the fact that the man is keeping a hold of the dog's lead whilst he is playing his instrument suggests that there is kind of this relationship and connection between the two, that the man feels a need to keep a hold of the dog rather than letting it roam around. And similarly, we're made aware that the dog is trained well enough to hold out an alms bowl and to beg for the man. And so that also suggests that it could have been trained well enough to operate as a guide dog or an assistance animal more broadly. And in doing so, it's employed as a servant to its master, receiving care and food, presumably in return for its service. So lastly then, I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of assistance dogs in visual source material. So as I suggested at the start of the paper, visual sources are not free of ideological gloss. And this is never truer than in images of medieval dogs. However, medieval dogs are particularly unstable signifiers. And as a result, they're kind of difficult to interpret in isolation. We have to think about the context in which they're depicted and the things that they are depicted alongside. On the PowerPoint, I've got two examples to illustrate what I mean. So in isolation, we have two white dogs with downward flopping ears that could potentially be quite similar. However, the one on the right is from a frontispiece of Simon de Vary's Book of Hours. So Simon commissioned this Book of Hours for himself after he'd recently been raised to noble status by Charles VII of France. So with this change in status, he then had the right to use heraldry, which was reserved for the noble classes, and he commissioned this heraldic shield in his prayer book as a kind of celebration of his new status. The actual shield itself has the fleur-de-lis. It's been painted over in later times. That's not his heraldry, just to point that out. So in Bedo Orio's 14th century treaty on arms, a dog used in a heraldic context is said to represent a loyal man who will not desert his lord and master in life or death, but will willingly die for his master. Bearing in mind Simon de Vary's relationship with the king and his recent rise in status, the fact that he chose to include a dog, which is a symbol of faithful, loyal service, to support his shield isn't particularly surprising. The dog on the left, on the other hand, could not be more different in its symbolism. So unlike the first dog, who is stood upright and proud, this animal has its head downcast and is eating its own vomit. So this is most likely a reference to the biblical book of Proverbs, which states that as a dog returneth to his vomit, so a fool returneth to his folly. And consequently, dogs could be used as visual indicators of the kind of imprudent, animalistic behaviour of men, and used as a didactic tool to encourage people to turn to God rather than return to their previous foolish ways. So we see the dogs being used as both a kind of symbol of imprudence and then faithfulness, so complete opposite ends of the spectrum there. So dogs were also used in medieval imagery to signify their owner's status and qualities. Consequently, the depiction of an individual with a dog could be used to indicate something about that person. So again, I've got two examples of this. So on the left-hand side, you can see an image of three nobles. There's two nobles at the top here, one at the bottom, and then a servant to the side there, who are participating in a hunt. And what I like about this is the kind of mirroring between the nobles on horseback and their dogs at the bottom there. So the dogs are equally as fit and healthy as the nobles. They've got their heads raised, much like the noble on foot here, and are charging towards the wild boar. This kind of mirroring of posture establishes the relationship between the two groups and suggests that there might be other shared features between the nobles and the dogs, such as the loyalty and faithfulness that I discussed earlier. On the right-hand side, at the other end of the social spectrum, dogs were also used as a visual signifier of blindness. So the relationship between blindness and dogs in art probably emerged for two reasons. Firstly, because it's very likely that the blind people were using dogs as assistance animals, but secondly, as a reference to the story of Tobit in the Bible. So in the book of Tobit, Tobit's son, Tobias, sets out to find a cure for his father's blindness and takes his dog with him. Whilst Tobias is not believed to have any impairments of his own, the story appears to have been condensed over time, with Tobias being cut out of the story and Tobit going to sort of seek the assistance with the dog. Again, this is a case of the kind of chicken or the egg, in the sense that was Tobit depicted with the dog because of the sort of condensed story, or was Tobit being depicted with the dog because people were used to seeing blind people using assistance animals? I'm not particularly sure, but I do have a nice image here of Tobit. Again, you can see the downcast eyes, the kind of closed eyes that symbolise blindness in medieval art. And just like the musician, he has his dog on a faded kind of orange lead attached to his wrist. So he is making use of that animal. And this appears as a visual trope throughout the Middle Ages and within manuscript marginalia. So overall then, just to sort of round up, I have no doubt that dogs were being used as assistance animals and mobility aids in the late Middle Ages, be that as companions, offering a sense of social interaction and safety, as servants, offering protection and assisting with daily tasks, or visually as kind of artistic signifiers, appearing in things like heraldic devices, artwork and manuscript marginalia to symbolise the status and the traits of their masters. Thank you very much.